right, I'll call this special board meeting on the budget to order. The first item on our agenda is revision of the 1920 school calendar. Ms. Trosclair.
Thank you, President Centeni. So we, of course, as you all know, adopted a Tier 1 curriculum, grades K-5 for next school year. With that curriculum comes the important piece of professional development. 7 days are required in year 1. We're able to do 3 days this summer with an additional 4 needed throughout the school year. Based on what we know about curriculum implementation and best practices with that, in order to make it a successful and effective implementation, that PD needs to come at in particular increments throughout the school year as teachers start to work in the curriculum. So the days that we proposed there are the 16th, September 16th. The vendors providing the PD say that's a good time because our teachers will have had a few weeks to get in that curriculum, and they get to what we call a frustration level with new implementation. So that's a good time to come and touch base. Another one, December 2nd, right behind the Thanksgiving holiday. We thought that was a good time. Our students are already off, so that might be easier for parents to extend that holiday. And again, February 27th are our proposed dates. We wanted to get it out and ahead of time, as early as possible, for folks to know that ahead of next school year.
No, we don't need to make a motion. That was an information item. Next item on the
Mr. Centine, we'll bring the calendar back for adoption at the April board meeting.
Thank you, sir. Next item on the agenda is the budget recap and timeline. Mr. Guidry.
Yes, our next meeting is scheduled for Wednesday, April 10th, immediately following the board meeting that will take place that same evening. And at that meeting, we're scheduled to complete our review of the group health and general fund budgets that will begin this evening. And beyond that, there have been no changes to the timeline.
Thank you very much. The next item on the agenda is the group insurance fund proposed budget. Mr. Guidry.
Yes, with regards to the group health insurance fund, the revenues reflect that there is no proposed increase to the premium rate schedule. And one of the ways, or the way that that was accomplished, is we took a look at the plan benefits. So I'll just review very briefly the plan benefit changes that have been presented to the insurance committee and will be presented to the board in the very near future for approval. There will be a couple of changes to be made to the footnotes. They're minor, but nonetheless they need to be made to be reflective of what was actually presented to the insurance committee, and I'll make note of it when we get to that point. The first item, and it's included in the footnote, is increasing the enhanced and basic PPO plan prescription drug out-of-pockets from $800 to $1,000. The second proposed change will be to increase the enhanced PPO medical out-of-pocket maximum from $4,200. It should read to $4,750. We'll make that change when we for our next meeting, in time for the next meeting. Next change is change to enhance PPO physician office visit copayment from $40 to $40 for primary care physicians and $55 for specialty care. So that's the second change. It's going to be changed from 50 to 55. Both of those just represent typos. And in fact, with those changes, it now agrees with what was presented to the insurance committee. Next item is to increase the basic PPO medical out-of-pocket maximum from $4,950 to $5,500 for an estimated total savings of $542,000. So those will be the proposed plan benefit changes, again, with no proposed increase to the premium rates. I'd ask at this point if there are any questions with regards to this particular proposed budget.
I know you mentioned it just now, but just to clarify, the items in note 1 that you just read through, those are changes that are recommended by the Employee Insurance Committee, correct?
I know they've been presented to the insurance committee.
I'm sure Ms. Bernard would be able to
Yes.
answer that for us.
She's on her way, so I'll ask her to comment. Oh, here we go. She's here.
In fairness, I could see her walking up and you couldn't.
Yes, sir. The committee has actually voted to recommend those to the board, and their minutes will be coming to y'all to reflect that.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Is there any public comments on the proposed group self-funded insurance budget? Any board member questions? Okay, so we'll now move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the summary of the 1920 general fund budget projected revenues and expenditures. Mr. Guidry.
Okay, the first section of the general fund budget summary is just our beginning fund balance. Those numbers are pulled from our fiscal year 18 audit report. The revenue section, I'll go over this and ask as we finish each section if there, we'll leave it up, we'll open it up to any questions. The local revenue section, basically composed of sales taxes. Our budget assumption for sales taxes is a 3% increase over current year's actual projected. The property taxes reflect a no growth budget assumption. We're basically budgeting flat with regards to property taxes, and that's based on our discussions with our tax assessor. Under state revenues, the major change there is our MFP, Minimum Foundation Program revenues from the Department of Education. This particular line item, which is on row 27, reflects an increase, a proposed increase of 1.25% in the per pupil amount. Right now it's $3,961 that's being used in prior years in this calculation. Bessie is recommending a 1.375% increase, but to be a little conservative, we've only recognized 1.25. So the recommendation by Bessie to the legislature, we'll know more hopefully in the coming months. It's 1.375. We're reflecting 1.25. In addition to that, Bessie is recommending a salary increase for our certificated personnel and non-certificated. Our certificated personnel, the recommendation is an annual increase of $1,000. Our non-certificated personnel, the annual increase is $500. Those two categories are tied to an annual report that's filed by our HR department with the Louisiana Department of Education. They tie it to object and function codes on that report, and that's what determines which employees qualify for the $1,000 and which employees qualify for the $500 state increase. That pretty much hits the high points with regards to local revenues, and on the federal revenue side, nothing of any material consequence there in terms of changes. Any questions with regards to the revenue section?
Mr. Lechley.
Mr. Guidry, I just had a question on, I was asked this today on the state pay increase. You're certified and you're non-certified. Certified includes, because I think our teachers and our administrators, there are two different pay scales, the way they're paid, our certified
Yes.
teachers and administrators.
That's correct.
Does the certified include our administrators?
Yes and no. It includes most of our administrators. One of the line items, just a few rows down, and we'll go over it probably in about 5 minutes or so, is to basically reconcile the two. Okay. There's about a little over 100 positions that are on the administrative pay scale.
Correct.
But they're non-certificated for purposes of the state increase. So
Right.
we're asking for that $500 to be able to just modify or adjust our administrative pay grade for everyone
Okay.
by $1,000.
Yeah, I was asked that 3 times today, so
Yeah.
I wanted to make sure I got the right answer for him.
So we'll go over that in a minute, but there were about a little over 100 that were on the administrative pay scale that did not get defined in the certificate or included in the certificated. So we're asking for the 500 so that we can keep the salary schedules easier to manage by just adding 1,000 to the administrative pay scale, and anybody on that pay scale would get the 1,000.
Thank you.
Are there any other board member questions? Are there any public comment or questions on the revenue portion of the general fund summary? Mr. Guidry, I have one question. Of the $10.4 million in the MFP increase, how much of that is the 1.25% increase, and how much of that is the certificated and non-certificated increase?
If you look at row 43, it shows the salary increase amount, so that's 4.3 million roughly.
So $6.2 million is the 1.25%?
Well, you also, in that number, you also have the charter school allocation that's in there. It's another 1.7.
Okay.
So you back out the 4.3, the 1.7, and that basically leaves you with the 1.375, and also about an increase of 1,000 students as far as our weighted average count go, our weighted student population. We have in the area of career and tech, because of the Jump Start program, there's a pretty significant increase there. So in the calculation, it gets weighted a little bit more because there are additional costs associated with that program. And it added across the board, there's about 5 areas that get additional funding, and that was approximately 1,000 students. So that's part of it as well.
Thank you. I don't believe
Okay,
there are any
so
other questions.
that's it for the revenue section. We'll move on. We'll move over to the expenditure section. First section under expenditures is on row 42, amount to be allocated to cost centers in schools. I'm just going to basically touch the highlights of this area. So if there's a particular row that I don't review because the amount's not very significant when compared to the overall budget, please, when we're done with this particular section, you can ask you questions at that point in time. Row 43 presents basically the expenditure side of the salary increase. So that particular row reflects the total cost, salaries, and benefits for both the certificated and non-certificated employee groups. Row 45, as I mentioned, this one is entitled Reconciled LPSS Salary Schedules to MFP Budget Letter Salary Increases. This $116,000 is what we need to be able to fund everyone at $1,000 who's paid off of the administrative salary schedule. So that's the adjustment there. And that ties to the question that Mr. Lochley asked earlier. Row number 46 is the step increase for all employees. It does not include the pay for performance stipend, but it does include the full step increase. Row number 46, I'm sorry, we just went over that. We'll go on to rows 47 through 56, basically deal with staffing allocations, where we're adjusting to board-approved staffing allocations. So I'll make mention of that so that you can review any and ask any questions that you may have. I just wanted to point out, when we're reporting these specific adjustments, if you look at row 51 and 52, the first thing we do is, in this case, I just thought it was a good example, is why I selected these 2 rows. The first line item, row 51, adjusts the assistant principal slots to the staffing ratio, and would indicate that we would reduce the number of assistant principal slots by 10.5 slots. Row 52 reflects the appeals that administration is recommending in that same amount of 10.5 slots. So ultimately, when you consider the two rows together, the impact is neutral. In other words, the number of positions would remain the same. So it would not reflect a reduction in the number of assistant principal slots. So I just wanted to make that clear, because if you don't look at the two rows together, then it may be a little misleading. Row 57 is a pay increase for interpreters. The effort there was meant to bring us more in line with Calcasieu Parish School Board, which I believe was mentioned when the interpreters requested a pay increase, and it's tiered in a similar manner. And by tiered, I mean depending on their assessment score would determine their hourly rate. Again, fashioned after or using Calcasieu as a basis to set up those tiers. Row 60 reflects a high demand incentive stipend for grades 6 through 12 math, science, and ELA teachers in our CIR schools. That's schools that have been labeled comprehensive intervention required schools. So that is what that particular line item relates to. Row 62 reflects an increase or provides for an increase in teacher substitutes daily rates for both short-term and long-term, non-degreed and degreed substitutes. Row 63 is a salary increase for all elementary principals to reflect an increase in the number of work days from 203 days to 213 days. Row 64 includes a salary increase for all assistant principals. The goal there was to increase the indexes such that the minimum increase would be at least $1,250. Of course, that would be the minimal amount. The idea being when someone goes from being a teacher to an assistant principal, they forego the 14th check. They're no longer eligible. So our goal is to have them at least recoup most of that so that their pay, the pay differential makes it worthwhile for them to consider making that change. Row 65 is an annual salary increase of $450 for support personnel, all full-time support personnel. Row 69 is a transfer to self-funded construction fund in the amount of one property tax mill. If you recall, about 2 years ago, the board approved a $0.5 mill. The idea being we'd set that money aside for pay-as-you-go projects, and maybe even at some point in time use it for debt service once we felt comfortable it was stable enough and repeating itself from year to year. So with this particular line item, we'll be putting 1.5 mills, which basically would put us a little over, right at about $3.2 million a year for that purpose. That takes care of the amounts to be allocated section. Before I move on to the cost center sections, I'd ask if there are any questions from board members.
All right, I want to ask Dr. Aguilar, are there any of these items, I know in the past you have requested that we approve some of these items that are time sensitive, or any of these items time sensitive, these that Mr. Guidry just reviewed, that would need approval tonight? Okay, thank you very much. Ms. Morrison.
Yes, Mr. Guidry, row 62, the increase in substitute pay, is that a flat rate or is there it's a different rate depending on their qualifications, or it's just a flat
It's
rate for all substitute teachers?
Well, there's different daily rates depending on their certification, so on and so forth. So a non-degreed, for example, the short-term non-degreed daily rate would go from 55 to 70. The long-term would go from $83 to $98 per day. For the degreed, it would go from 65 to 75, and long-term degree would be 94 to 104. In looking at these rates and coming up with these rates, we basically, HR was instrumental in gathering information from school districts in the Acadiana area and making these proposed changes to put us in a more competitive posture when it comes to substitutes.
And if anyone following along would like the written version of Mr. Guidry's answer on page 9 of this document, footnote number 8 explains exactly what the increases to each class of substitute teacher is. Are there any other board member questions right now? Are there any public comment on the items that Mr. Guidry just reviewed? Remind the board members that if there are any motions that you would like to remove something from the budget, add something to the general fund budget, or approve something this evening, then this is the agenda item to make your motion. With that pointed out, Mr. Guidry, you can proceed to the cost centers.
Okay, with regards to the cost centers, again, I'm going to focus on those that are basically exceed $200,000 in terms of them being somewhat material. Once I'm done, if there are any that I have not reviewed that you'd like to know a little bit more about, of course, feel free to ask any questions. The first one that we'll take a look at is row 79. It's cost center 1109, workers' compensation payments. You'll notice that there's a proposed increase column, proposed decrease column. And in the proposed decrease column, you'll see an amount of $328,771. That amount needs to be netted against the amount in the administrative adjustments column of $278,779 in arriving at a net decrease of $49,992. So initially, the $328,000 decrease was based on where we finished last year. Our workers' comp claims had decreased from the previous 5 years. In looking at what this year projects out to be, we're having a good year this year, but not as good as last year in terms of claims. And so we adjusted it to where we think we're going to finish the current year. So that's why you see the administrative adjustment. The net decrease amount, which is a good thing, that means we're decreasing the budget, is $49,992. Row 80, cost center 1110, insurance administration, reflects a total increase of $617,788. The lion's share of that, $500,000, relates to the liability claims line item. And the reason why we're proposing that is if you take a look at a 6-year history, in 18, our liability claims were about $500,000 to $600,000 less than it had been in the previous 5 years. And looking at where we are in the current year and where we're projecting to be, it looks like our numbers are going to be more in line with the previous 5 years as opposed to last year. So we needed to increase it to get it to a point where we'll have adequate budget for that particular line item for our liability claims. Row 93, cost center 1213, energy management. You'll see an increase there, proposed increase there of $560,000, and that's reflective of the addition of our MP Moss Annex office annex, BO Elementary coming online, as well as the air conditioning of all the gymnasiums. We have most of that finishing up right now, so they should be in operation. All of the schools should basically be using it for the next fiscal year. So that increase is reflective of those changes. Road 95, cost center 1216, the August 2016 flood. We're just zeroing out that budget because we're done with the project. So when we roll over the budget, we roll over the current year budget to next year. That's our starting point. Well, we finished it up this year, so we don't need to roll it over. So we're backing it out. That is the reduction that's being reflected there. Row 135, cost center 1428, textbooks, a net increase of $1,739,829, and that's mainly attributable to our K-5 ELA adoption, inclusive of our UIR schools at the middle and high school levels. So K-5 adoption, as well as our UIR schools at middle and high, and that pretty much accounts for most of the increase for that particular cost center. Row 171, cost center 1482, school resource officers. That particular line item is reflective of the addition of 4 additional school resource officers. Paul Bro, Karen Crow Middle, Baranco, Bio are 2 new schools that are opening, Paul Bro Middle and Lafayette Middle. Along with the sergeant from a supervisory standpoint, and then we also placed funding in there for the 2% increase in contract rates. Row number 186, cost center 1514, health and life insurance premium. The increase there is $679,764. That increase was, or a very large portion of that increase was just recently approved at the March 13th board meeting, and it related to retiree health premiums, the board's contribution. Because the budget roll forward had already taken place in the budget process, that increase was not included in that roll forward. The board approved it after. So just like we needed the funds to finish the current year, we'll need the same amount of funds for next year. So that's why the adjustment is showing up as a proposed increase. Row 188, cost center 1516, external transfers. That increase reflected there. A little over $1 million, and it's basically relates to the allocation to the charter schools. We're seeing the increase that we mentioned in the per pupil amount in the MFP and the state pay increase. They get a share of that, so that's why that number is going up. Road number 192, cost center 1526. These are one-time projects, and most of this amount that's reflected there, the $338,129, represents the funds that are being transferred from capital. When we went through the capital budgets, there were a listing of projects that didn't meet the $25,000 threshold, so they weren't couldn't be included in the capital projects. So we basically moved them to the general fund and transferred. Budgeted to transfer capital funds. So these are those projects. If you look in the revenue side, the transfer from capital funds is there. So basically it offsets to zero. And that represents all of the cost center adjustments that exceed $200,000. So at this point, if there are any other of the cost centers I had not covered that a board member has a question about, we'd be happy to try and answer those questions.
Mr. Angel.
Really, this is, I think it's 93, but it's and maybe this should be directed to Dr. Aguilar or someone else, but I'm curious in terms of utilities in general. Do we have a program whereby we are going to replace all of our lighting, et cetera, with LED lighting, or are we already doing that? That's more, I mean, it's less expensive and it's more, and better. Are we doing anything like that?
I believe that some of our projects that we have budgeted in our in the capital area, are in fact replacing current lighting with LED lighting. I don't know if Mr. Bourdon is here. He could provide more details. I think in some of our gyms, for certain, that's part of the game plan.
Good evening, members of the board. Kyle Bartlon, Director of Planning and Facilities. In the last couple of years, we have replaced all the gym lighting, which is really high bay lighting. We've replaced that with LED lighting, simply for two reasons. One was maintenance, because the LED lighting lasts so much longer, and it eliminates a lot of the maintenance work of having to bring lifts in and change bulbs. And the secondary thing is the energy savings. To answer your question directly, no, we do not have a program in place to replace lighting. However, on these wing addition projects that are being constructed or about to be constructed, we are having LED lights installed in those wings. I'm also currently trying to explore something that is sort of being offered by Entergy of Louisiana. It's an LED program. I haven't gotten all the details yet, so I don't know exactly any of the incentives that they're offering or whatever. And it would only be good for schools that are being served by power from Entergy, which is about 8 or 10 schools at this time. But if I can find that that's going to be a benefit to us, I'll bring that back to the board, because there probably would be some upfront costs with the potential of those savings paying for the upfront costs over time.
Thank you, Mr. Angel. That was a very interesting topic. Any other board member questions or comments? Are there any public questions or comments on the individual cost center items that Mr. Guidry just reviewed? Okay. We'll move to the next item on the agenda, which is the general fund cost center detail for the 1100 series cost centers. Mr. Guidry, I will simply ask board members if there are any motions that anyone would like to make, as this item will cover in detail what the summary page that Mr. Guidry just reviewed told us all. So if you want to see the individual increases and decreases broken down by line items, this is where you would look. So unless there are any other questions or comments, I will simply ask if there are any motions to be made for the 1100 series cost centers. And I'm going to give you guys a couple of minutes just to make sure you don't. Okay, hearing none, we'll move to item 2.6, the cost center detail for the 1200 series cost centers. I'll do the same thing and ask if there are any motions that board members would like to make for the 1200 series cost centers. Mr. Latchley.
I don't want to make a motion. I just want to ask staff if maybe they can come back later or if they can answer it now. I noticed some of our departments here, overtime increases, and maybe what is leading to these increases in overtime. Where are we spending our overtime dollars? I see office and clerical. Looks like we're already over for the year for the current budget baseline. Labor overtime, just overtime period as a system of.
A majority of the overtime is in the maintenance area.
Okay.
That's the biggest piece of it. You'll see some slight increase requests for some of our cost centers, and a lot of that's attributable to some of the things like the student handbooks, things that have become a little bit more involved. We're having to have them basically translated into different languages. So projects of that nature that require more time than they have previously. In the case of the business office, the Department of Labor has reclassified some of our employees as from exempt to non-exempt. So they were going from salary to hourly. So not a significant amount of increase is there. I mean, we've looked at it and try to keep it to a minimum. But for those few hours that they will be working during budgets and during year-end close, we will have to pay them time and a half as opposed to salaried, which is what they were considered before. So that's an explanation for that particular department. The rest are pretty minor, but tied to just some of the different things that have to be done that in the past might be increased reporting requirements from the state, things of that nature.
So I'll put some meat on that bone there, and just the first one that came up was personnel, call center 1202, and the current budget has $29,805.76, which was increased through your budget adjustment process to $56,953, and then increased again by another $32,000 to $88,953.52. So by my count, that is $64,000 in overtime more than the current fiscal year, so I guess the question is twofold. What is the explanation for that increase, and do we have a general management rule of thumb where we are spending money at time and a half and we say to ourselves, let's go ahead and hire somebody permanently to work those hours?
With regards to the increased request, the explanation provided there is the additional work required due to opening the new schools and rezoning. And to answer your question with regards to a comparison of overtime versus new staff, yes, we do that annually. We took a look at it here. Another area is in the area of payroll. Getting payroll out by a specific date. It hadn't quite gotten to the point where it would cover an additional person's salary and benefits, but when it does, we will look at replacing that over time with a request for a full-time individual.
Thank you. Are there any other questions and or motions to be made on this agenda item? Hearing none, we'll go to 2.7, the cost center detail for the 1300 series cost center. The same question. Are there any questions and or motions to be made on this item? Hearing none, I will move to item 2.8, the general fund cost center detail for the 1400 series cost centers. Are there any questions and or motions for this item? Hearing none, I will move to item 2.9, the general fund cost center detail for the 1500 series cost centers. Are there any questions and or motions for this agenda item? Hearing none, I will have a brief announcement. As Mr. Guidry said at the beginning of the meeting, our next meeting on the budget is scheduled for April 10th, immediately following the regular board meeting. The agenda will be identical to this one. So please, if you have questions or comments to make, you may go home and study these documents, bring them back on April 10th, and we will certainly follow the same format where we ask for questions and comments and motions. That being said, meeting is adjourned.